All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first learning event of Interaction's new Environmental Sustainability Working Group. Today's event is entitled Organizational Environmental Sustainability Amidst Climate Change and COVID-19. And we're really excited that you can all be with us today. My name is Lindsay Doyle, and I manage Interaction's work on climate change. Back in April, your organization signed the NGO Climate Compact, committing to begin actions in 4 key areas related to both mitigating climate change and adapting to its effects. I'm really pleased that we're hosting Interaction members and partners today to share their knowledge and expertise on organizational sustainability, as this is one of the key commitment areas of the Climate Compact. We have with us today David Guier, Senior Director with Global Communities and PCI. We also have Shengyin Xu, Global Sustainability Manager with World Resources Institute, as well as Karl Erdmann, Senior Director for Grants and Business Development at Americares. With most of us entering what has seemed like a very long period of time, our 4th month of telework as a result of COVID, there are more and more conversations about how we can, as a sector, build on the recent progress around decreasing global greenhouse gas emissions. And it's a discussion that, about whether these reductions will be ephemeral or whether we can actually put in place the practices to hold that steady and to push both government and business to do the same. So although it might seem like a daunting task on top of the many demands that I know we're all under, it's definitely mission critical. Today's session is structured more or less like a webinar with about 50 minutes of content. If you have a question at any point in the conversation, don't hesitate to drop that in the chat box. David, Shengyin, and Karl will cover several different learning topics over the course of this conversation, and we'll pause partway through to answer any questions their presentation might have stimulated. We'll also have time at the end to have a more full Q&A session and dialogue where I encourage you to unmute and ask your question verbally. Please do include your name and affiliation anytime you ask a question. And lastly, I'll remind everyone that today's session is being recorded and will be posted to our climate resource library on our website so you can refer back to it as you need. So to get us started, we wanted to kick it off with a quick anonymous poll to get a sense of where organizations are at in their own sustainability journey. So I'll launch the poll now. Hopefully you can see it. And the question here is, where is your organization on the environmental sustainability curve? With 1 being, we haven't found the curve yet, and 5 being, we've conquered the climb. So go ahead and just click in your response. And I'll post the results when I see we have most responses in. All right, I think I'll end it there. And so hopefully you can see the poll results now. A good majority of folks kind of in that introductory stage of trying to figure this all out, as well as kind of starting to make some progress. So that's really good to see. Interaction also, I wanted to mention, just finished the data collection for a membership survey that dives into the details of members' progress in all the 4 commitment areas. And we've got a really good response rate, so look forward to sharing that data with you in the weeks to come. So with that teaser, I will turn it over to our presenters to take it from here.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Shengyin Xu, as Lindsay mentioned. I'm the Global Sustainability Manager at WRI, and I think on the sustainability curve, WRI is somewhere between a 3 and a 4, and we may always operate under the assumption that we're not at a 5 yet, because it is a very kind of iterative process for us.
Hi, everyone. I'm David Guier from Global Communities. In addition to being a senior manager, I'm the leader of our green team. On the sustainability curve, I'd rate Global Communities at a 2.5 or 3, halfway there. And that we're already halfway is in large part because of our green business certification, which we will talk a bit about during this presentation. And I also have great hopes that the Interaction Climate Compact will carry us further along the curve.
And I'm Karl Erdmann, Senior Director of Grants and Business Development at Americares, and I also lead our Sustainability Working Group. I actually ranked Americares at about a 2, and I see that most other folks on this webinar are also about it at 2, meaning that we've started to think about the topic and form our ideas and approaches to it, but we still have a lot of work to go to become a more sustainable organization. All right, so I'll kick us off today to kind of talk about why we're here to discuss this topic. I thought that this image that I put up here on the screen really resonated with kind of showing where we are right now in this moment. The figure depicts global average temperatures from about 1850 and projects them out until 2200. And each vertical line represents a year, and the color depicts the average global temperature during that year. And so starting over on the left-hand side of the figure, you see that you have more green and blue hues, which corresponds with a milder temperature. But as you progress over time and start moving to the right, the bars get lighter and lighter and then switch to orange up until where it says "we are here." And "we are here," I believe, was the year 2019, which was the second hottest year on record. And then the graph splits and shows 2 possible scenarios. The first scenario, which is on top, is what things are going to look like with business as usual. We keep commuting to work in our gasoline-powered vehicles. We keep getting our energy supply from mostly fossil fuels, and as a result, more CO2 is put into the atmosphere, and temperatures will continue to rise until 2020, where you can see the shading is nearly brown. The other track is the one below, which is where if we were to make drastic changes to the way we fuel our economy and switch over to much more renewable sources. You can see that the color scheme continues to be red and above the 1850 averages, but is considerably lower than what it would be if we continue as business as usual. But again, this is more than just about temperature when we're talking about climate change, and I'll turn it over to Shengyin to talk about some of the other effects of what we're possibly going to face.
Yeah, so I think the graphic that Karl shared is a really great illustration of that wider picture of where we've come from and where we are headed in 2 different scenarios of global warming. But even right now, there are a lot of in-your-face images and actions that are happening that really showcase why it matters. It's been projected that by 2050, the generation of our children and our grandchildren, sea level rise will impact over 300 million people living near coasts. And even just last year, we saw immense flooding in Venice disrupt tourism and everyday life. With the warming temperatures, the oceans have been bleaching coral reefs. This is a current image, not a projection. And then last year as well, which feels very far away right now, there were record temperatures causing droughts that then exacerbated wildfires. We also saw more severe weather. Hurricane damage in the US was estimated to be $22 billion just in 1 year. And then more locally, cities and towns, the food that we eat and the water that we need to survive is also at stake. Cape Town recently was approaching what they call day 0 when they expected to run out of water. And we talk a lot about food as well. Droughts, water shortages, and growing population put a lot of strain on our food systems. And then finally, the human health impact of it all. Pollution, as well as disastrous weather, drought conditions, extreme conditions, have a huge environmental justice impact. And more in our minds today, it has a long-term impact on disease and the spread of pandemics as well. So there are a lot of reasons to act now. And I think part of our presentation goal today is to really get into some more of the practical ways that we can start today and start getting off of that very dark red pathway that Karl showed in his diagram.
Thank you, Karl and Shengyin. So here's our agenda today. We're going to cover ways to marshal support for organizational change, sustainability initiatives you can implement in a program of change, some challenges to expect and how to prepare for as you're implementing a program of change, and what are some of the many resources and solutions out there, all focused on a more sustainable future. So let's get started. Ways to marshal support for organizational change. And let me just say, this topic is geared more towards organizations just getting started with sustainability. So if you're one of the organizations that are a little further along the curve, please bear with us. So one way to marshal support for change is to gauge green interest amongst your staff. This can be important in determining whether your organization is ready for change. At Global Communities, a survey in 2016 unexpectedly revealed strong staff concern about climate change, which created an opportunity to start talking about a program of sustainability. In part because of the survey, Global Communities president became an early supporter of discussions around organizational sustainability. This is an important aspect of organizational change, having supporters in high places. Nowadays, funders and prime contractors and recipients are increasingly looking for sustainability credentials. This can also be leveraged to support change. Networking with like-minded organizations and individuals brings many benefits: new perspectives, shared knowledge and experience, increased visibility for your organization, to name a few. Global Communities, WRI, and Americares are good places to start networking, even today. And here's another place to get started.
Some of you may already be familiar with our informal group called the Sustainability Managers Roundtable. That's where Karl, Lindsay, David, and I met. We meet monthly virtually to share knowledge, and more recently we've started to collaborate on projects like this presentation, as well as conversations around renewable energy purchasing and business travel surveys. So it's a great group, fun, like-minded individuals, and a lot of knowledge sharing going around. Welcome any new members.
And let me add, it's not a huge time sink. We meet once a month for an hour, and it's well worth that time. An important resource for organizational change, let's call it a human resource, is like-minded staff members. So developing a team, a green team, allows for sharing of responsibility and workload and building a sense of we're in this together. Teams brainstorm and problem solve more effectively than individuals, and really teams are just more fun than going it alone. So to get started, not much is needed in the way of financial resources, just some staff time and commitment. As the program develops though, financial resources may be required to engage speakers, to purchase food for green events, or to purchase green promotional materials, green swag. At Global Communities, our CFO allocates an annual amount from the G&A pool for such expenses. And staff time spent on green initiatives is also a G&A expense. Oops, went too far there.
WRI has a slightly different approach for funding our sustainability initiative. We have an internal carbon price that we set on some activities at WRI, including our business travel, electricity, and staff commute. And so that revenue goes to support staff time, events, bike share programs, and many of our other activities.
So let's move on to our next learning topic, sustainability initiatives. This is the largest part of today's presentation. Of the sustainable initiatives, we have 7 categories, as you can see here. As we move through what are actually quite a few different initiatives, you can keep track of where you are by following the bar at the bottom of this slide. So the first category of sustainability initiatives falls under what we call sustainability mainstreaming, initiatives of a higher level that bolster an organization's culture, values, or perhaps existing practices. Developing environmental policies and guidelines can be an important first step in establishing a sustainability program because they can set boundaries for acceptable and unacceptable behavior. It's been our experience at Global Communities that if you have a policy or rule, let's call it a stick, as a justification for a course of action, most staff are going to follow it without complaint. Environmental policies and guidelines can also address other organizational impacts, such as social and health-related impacts. I'm happy to share Global Communities' environmental policies and guidelines with anyone who requests a copy. Green Business Certification provides a useful framework for building sustainable workplace practices. Global Communities was fortunate in that Montgomery County, where we are located, has a strong Green Business Certification program. I can say from experience just how transformative it was to dive in, marshal the staff, the resources, and approvals to meet the certification requirements and then begin to implement those requirements. Many states and localities have Green Business Certification programs. I've put 2 up here, California and Vermont. There are also several national green certification programs, including Green Seal and the Green Business Bureau. Costs for third-party green certification programs can vary widely from hundreds of dollars to thousands of dollars. So this is about sustainability awareness raising, which is key to building support for sustainability and countering staff apathy and indifference, which is one of the big challenges of workplace sustainability. If organizational policy is the stick, awareness raising can be the carrot. If the messages are clear, solution-oriented, and answer the question why it matters. Here you'll see some examples of Global Communities' sustainability awareness raising activities in the last year.
Here also is a look at Americares sustainability awareness raising initiatives. This was derailed this year, mostly as a result of COVID and all of us working from home and not being able to gather and get together for these brown bags. But now that we've sort of found our footing and have normalized the work from home approach, we'll probably be doing these virtually this fall for staff. But our sustainability working group was working on putting together a series of brown bag presentations. These would be sort of voluntary engagements to have interested staff come and learn about these topics. And some of these topics are just displayed up here as examples. For example, Americares is a global health organization. So what is climate change going to mean for global health, and also the unequal consequences that it will have for people of different socioeconomic and resource levels. Another topic was going to be looking at our own organizational carbon footprint to kind of take a deep dive into our own sources of carbon and thinking about ways of how to reduce those emissions. A third topic was on decarbonization, sort of at a global level. What would that mean, and how would that what would that look like if we were to transition off of fossil fuels? What does that mean in terms of the types of energy and how we would be able to produce it, and the kinds of changes that it would take and make in our lives? And then the fourth topic was on our own personal carbon footprints and how our choices as consumers and individuals can contribute to climate change, with the caveat, of course, that we, of course, recognize the importance of collective action 100% on this issue.
And at WRI, we have been working together with HR to really think about how we can build sustainability awareness in the way we do a lot of our HR-related processes. So at the hiring stage for some of our interviews, we ask candidates how they might walk the talk on the WRI mission at home or in their previous workplaces. One of the most impactful awareness building activities we did was to add a sustainability component to our onboarding and induction day. So from day one, we shared with staff what are some of the things to know about zero waste, about the biking program. And a lot of folks were then able to build those habits in without having to make changes. So that was really a big impact. And then moving forward, we've been looking to incorporate it more into our employee handbook, into those policies, into finding ways that staff can build it into their professional development plans to level up, but with a consideration for how sustainability and walking the talk fits into that. And then finally, we have been working to incorporate sustainability in our performance review process as well. So completing that spectrum from when you're hired to the training that goes on, to reviewing your year and seeing how walking the talk went for you.
So on to rollout of green initiatives to other locations. This may be one of the most impactful of the initiatives we're looking at today. Recently, Global Communities merged with Project Concern International, an NGO based in San Diego, California. And together with their programming, we are in 35 countries. So that's potentially a lot of impact.
Similarly, we rely a lot on our network of sustainability advocates. We call our group the Sustainability Champions. And it does take quite a bit of time to actively recruit and make sure we have a champion for every program, center, and international office. And they provide us invaluable feedback on how to adapt the programs for the different geographies.
And likewise at Americares, we launched a sustainability working group within the last year. This is a cross-departmental group of staff that includes representatives from all of the major departments and also representatives from our field offices as well. And it's a, I mentioned it's a voluntary group. So all of these people have, full-time jobs, but we come together on a monthly basis and in between as well to talk about how Americares can be a more sustainable organization and to kind of brainstorm ideas for getting us on that track.
So next group of initiatives concerns greenhouse gases. In 2019, total greenhouse gas emissions from all human activities was estimated to be around 43 billion tons. And that's a 90% increase since 1970. Climate science conclusively links the rise in emissions to the rise in global temperatures. There's at least one important reason for an organization to measure its greenhouse gas emissions, to establish a baseline against which to compare and set reduction targets in the future.
So WRI was one of the co-authors of the GHG protocol and the standards for corporate greenhouse gas emissions accounting. Back in 1999, when we first started to promote that tool and that set of standards, we felt the need to road test it ourselves and start tracking our operational GHG emissions. So that was one element of the measurement, that it lended credibility to the research and work we did. But moving forward, the inventory was an important piece to our commitment to transparency and sharing our progress. And more recently, we've started to utilize the data with staff engagement as well. So more frequently than the annual report, using that GHG emissions data, using electricity data, waste data, to really engage staff to try and achieve our science-based targets. And another note on that is Science-Based Targets is another initiative that started in around 2010. It's a way to set GHG emissions reduction goals once you have your baseline, These goals then align with a scenario of only 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming. So essentially, you don't have to arbitrarily say we want to reduce our emissions X amount. We then can confidently say if we were able to globally reduce our emissions in this sector by 20–30%, that would mean we can stay on that lower path of global warming that we showed in the slide earlier. All these tools are available to anyone. We have a GHG protocol website and a science-based target website that you're welcome to visit.
And at Americares, we've taken first steps to tracking our or measuring our greenhouse gas emissions. As a organization, we ship a lot of humanitarian aid and medical commodities all over the world. We do that by truck, by sea, by air shipment as well. And so accounting for all of the emissions from all that transport is what you see up here. And we've been able to measure that based on the volume of freight that we've shipped and the modalities. So whether we're shipped by air, sea, or surface. That's just one piece of our GHG emissions. We obviously have buildings and staff commutes and everything also to account as well, but this was a first step for us.
So on to waste reduction and recycling. It's not only rising temperatures that threaten our future, resource depletion does as well. Folks, there is no planet B, and planet A's resources are finite. Sustainable as opposed to throwaway practices will help ensure that future generations can also meet their resource needs.
So when WRI started its path towards zero waste, we actually, back in 2007, really were narrowly focused on fixing our recycling problem. A building-wide waste audit really revealed to us how poorly we were doing on recycling. We were seeing over 27% weight of recycling in the recycling bins that were not actually recyclable. And so that meant a lot of potential materials that could be recycled would then be contaminated and the whole batch would be thrown out. So as an environmental organization, I think we were very startled by that, but also we weren't too surprised because inherently we knew we wanted more things to be recyclable than the reality. So the focus of our initial efforts was really to convince people that to throw away some things that are actually not recyclable is important because we actually put the rest of the recycling into the bin that way. So we did a Recycle Right campaign. It was very specific to materials that we were finding through our waste audit process. And through that process, we were able to reduce contamination a lot. This is an example of a poster. One of the things that's quite popular in offices is a disposable coffee cup. So we did a whole poster series, a little tongue-in-cheek in terms of the complexity of recycling, and diagrammed what's recyclable and what actually needs to go into the landfill in order for us to successfully recycle. This was one in a series of 6, and we ran the campaign for about 6 weeks with a number of other events and prizes and fun activities. Once we handled the recycling piece, that took us about a year or so, and we also established a means for us to do waste audits to track our progress. We finally felt we were able to launch a compost pilot. And together with our building management company and landlord, we essentially arranged to have compost picked up from our office and really focused in on making sure it wasn't contaminated, as well as meeting our zero waste goal of 90% diversion to compost and recycling. So the waste audits kept us honest. It also gave us really good insight on what the problematic materials were that were getting sorted incorrectly all the time. And then we'd adapt the campaigns to those materials every quarter. The global offices also started to get involved. It's a little different in each of the geographies, but our Brazil office, for example, the image on the right, launched their worm bin recycling that the champions maintain. And the India offices did something similar with a bokashi system in urns.
So locally in the DC metro area, there are several commercial compost companies. Global Communities and WRI both use veteran compost. Prices are quite reasonable. Before the coronavirus shutdown, Global Communities was diverting around 75 pounds of compostable material from the landfill every week at a cost of only $80 per month. Landlords may take some convincing to allow a commercial compost operation on their premises, though. Think fear of attracting rats.
On the zero waste target, one of the most impactful pieces, especially if you're tracking waste audits by weight, is food waste. And we follow the EPA's food recovery hierarchy. One of our sustainability champions is our event manager, and she has instituted an approach where we order 75% less than the RSVPs for large events. And even with that reduction, we still have leftover food that we then donate to a shelter 2 blocks away. All that is before we consider composting that food waste.
Last year, Global Communities introduced a plastic-free policy, including elimination of single-use plastic, silverware, and water bottles. This policy was designed to support efforts to keep plastic out of human and animal food chains and out of our oceans. Not every staff member applauded that decision. So now let's move on to environmentally preferable purchasing.
So for WRI, we do our GHG inventories every year, and we've built out our indirect emissions calculations. And one of our largest areas is from our purchases of goods, services, and our agreements with our partners. So one of the things that we've been working on is improving our sustainable purchasing approach. And it can be a big challenge to try and vet each item that you purchase for the range of sustainability factors that you may be thinking of. There are factors such as GHG emissions, embodied energy, pollution of air, pollution of water, and many more. And human toxicity is also a really important one now. So we rely a lot on third-party certifications for the goods that we purchase. So for example, for paper, we're looking for a number of certifications like FSC, Ancient Forests, Rainforest Alliance. For coffee, it's a little different. For cleaning and laptops, there's all sorts of certification programs for sustainability in each sector. One central resource that we found very helpful is the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council. It is a member-based organization, but they offer great discounts for nonprofits. And they maintain a resource that's been vetted and worked on through a number of sector stakeholder groups. So essentially you can look up standard language for sustainable purchasing, as well as third-party certification programs for each sector, such as paper, electronics, apparel, textiles, building and construction materials. It's a very wide range, and it's a very nice resource for it. On food, though, it's a little different. We have a food program that's done amazing research on the impacts for the environment on shifting diets, as well as recovering food waste. So working together with our research team, we created our food policy, which essentially requires every event, meeting, any small thing that WRI purchases to be vegetarian and vegan. And the other aspect of the research that the team had been working on is the behavioral science aspect of talking about food. And they were seeing that it was really important to avoid declaring things were healthy or vegetarian, and really just describing the food and how you know, the textures and the ingredients were delicious, essentially. And so part of our strategy for our food policy is also to not declare at the beginning of meetings that all of this is world-saving vegetarian or vegan food. We essentially share the food that's good. We let them know what the ingredients are for allergy reasons. And otherwise, the focus of the policy is really providing resources to serve diverse and delicious vegetarian food.
So there's no shortage of green purchasing options for office supplies, for promotional materials, for food events, or for any other good or service. At Global Communities, we found, especially with food purchases, that the beautiful website touting the vendor's sustainability credentials doesn't always match the food or the service delivered. But we view this as a learning opportunity for the vendor and for the service industry. If you take the time to let vendors know that waste reduction and sustainable practices are important to you, the buyer, they typically respond positively. And hopefully over time, industry will get the message and respond as well.
And moving away from some of the more tangible goods and that we purchase as organizations, the services and the partnerships that we have are also a very large portion. So we've started to work on ways that we can use those contracts as a means to share sustainability ambitions and ask for something similar from our partners. So examples include for our partnership agreement with WRI, working with other nonprofits, it's a little lighter touch. They have to complete an appendix to the contract that essentially asks if they do GHG inventories, and if they don't, if they're interested in learning more. And for vendors, we're hoping our next step will be to push them to be doing GHG inventories, setting science-based targets, and reporting all of that to CDP or on their websites. For those that might do a little bit more on the contracting or building delivery or direct public procurement of services, there's also means to incorporate sustainability language into your RFPs and RFQs, looking to vet some of these vendors for sustainability experience or having that in their operations.
So on to travel and transportation. By one estimate, air travel contributes up to 3% of the United States total GHG emissions. Once the coronavirus shutdown ends and we're all back in our offices, if we continue with the business as usual approach to air travel, the number of air trips is expected to triple by 2050.
So I think the pandemic has shifted our sort of goalposts in terms of what is considered essential travel versus non-essential travel, and I do hope that once things are back to normal and we get back in the office, that we do take a second look at our travel policies and try to reduce air travel in particular, because that is certainly a huge part of Americares' carbon footprint for sure. Here is a diagram that from the World Wildlife Fund that could help organizations kind of streamline their air travel and include something like this in their travel policies, whereby going from the bottom of the diagram to the top, it shows the level of social presence, from face-to-face up at the top all the way down to email at the bottom, versus on the right side of the diagram, it shows frequency. So if you have an established relationship and an established partner, try to make those phone calls and emails, versus if you have a really complex project or relationship to develop, those are the instances where you would need a face-to-face visit and potentially an air ticket as well. But this is just one way of introducing these concepts to organizations to kind of make sure that they're making their travel decisions against some kind of criteria.
So Global Communities has historically done a lot of international travel. It aligns with our mission, with many of our work objectives, and with professional development goal setting for junior staff, getting junior staff out in the field. Notwithstanding that, in January this year, we took a step towards reducing air travel impact by establishing a modest carbon offset program. Travelers can donate up to $10 of their per diem, and Global Communities matches that amount from unrestricted funds. The program is on hold for now, but once we're back in the office, there will be two challenges as I see it: how to make wise, verifiable carbon offset purchases, and whether air travel at Global Communities will return to business as usual.
I think we mentioned a little before that we fund the WRI Sustainability Initiative using a carbon price. When we started that process up in 2010, we also meant for the carbon price to be a disincentive for air travel. So essentially, an example would be between DC and Europe, a round trip may cost about $60 in carbon price. We have learned over time that our GHG emissions for air travel has increased, but at a lower rate than the increase of our overall staff and revenue. So on a per capita perspective, we have seen that go down. I wouldn't necessarily attribute it all to carbon pricing. I think part of that is just the natural sort of economy of scale there. But the carbon price itself has been very helpful in that it allows us to then fund a lot of initiatives. One of which is recently to figure out other ways that we can approach convincing folks to reduce their air travel. Right now, we're all grounded, and it seems like we will do well in 2020 data, but what we want to do is to be ready for when people expect to return to normal travel with new systems of control for reduced air travel. And then it was mentioned before, but travel policies can play a very big role in how people approach their air travel for work. For example, the travel policies could include a little bit more leeway to take direct flights, even if they are more expensive. They could either enforce or encourage economy class. It's not ideal in terms of comfort, but from a GHG perspective, it is lower per person. And also a little bit more complex, but finding ways to optimize travel when you do have to do travel by doing multi-city trips, sending fewer staff for one event, or sending regional staff instead. I think all of these pieces together can be part of the travel policy to kind of encourage the shift in when we do have to travel. It could be a little bit more efficient. And then finally, promoting rail alternatives. In some regions, like in the Northeast Corridor in the US or in Europe particularly, it is a lot easier to take rail to different destinations, and finding ways that you can further incentivize doing that. The image on the right is actually a program out of the UK called Climate Perks. They're specifically incentivizing the use of rail for personal travel or vacation, but the participants, the employers that do sign up for it, offer additional PTO days to encourage their staff to do so, essentially offsetting the perceived additional time for taking rail instead of flights. And on the topic of encouraging behaviors, we have an active commute program in the WRI US office. Through the use of some granular commute survey data, we've been seeing that there's a big opportunity in the US office to increase biking, walking, and running into work. And I think now that we're talking about reoccupying buildings after the pandemic and continuing back to our commutes, it's also a good time to convince people to shift their commute behaviors now that we've taken months off of our typical patterns, and people may be a little bit more hesitant about taking a taxi or an Uber or a Lyft or a bus. We'll likely be reinforcing some of our bike, walking, and running campaign materials. To further support that, though, we also have worked with the building to increase biking infrastructure, secure parking, lockers, showers, maintenance stands. We do offer the bike share incentive. Capital Bike Share has a corporate membership program that's really easy to use in DC. And then the majority of our efforts around shifting commute behaviors is really communication, data, and socializing the activities. So we organize a lot of rides together with staff. We've even had after work walks together. We set group goals, and we use these events as a way to move the needle on those targets. And once people get comfortable with that, and they find mentors and bike buddies to ride along with as well in the long term.
So on to energy and water efficiency, just a few slides here.
So one of our 3 science-based targets is to reduce our electricity use at WRI by 50% in order to maintain 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming. So we realized in 2019 at the end of the year when we started to process the data that we've achieved a 50% absolute reduction in emissions, which we're very excited about. But that happened over a long period. In a course of 9-10 years. There were building renovations that have happened. The building owner went through a LEED existing building recommissioning process, and they got certified at platinum level. And through that process, they were doing all sorts of optimizations to the heating and cooling system, which makes up a large portion of electricity use in buildings. And so in the last few years, it's really been about further driving that down. After all those infrastructural updates, we're now looking at more granular data, like the image on the upper left is our submeters. We can actually see for 4 zones in our office how we're doing for electricity consumption, and push that down further, working with the building, but then also encouraging our staff to be active participants in shutting down their equipment and using power strips overnight as well. And renewable energy is another component of our energy goals. We, in our last green lease negotiation with our building owner, they now purchase renewable energy certificates for us. And these unbundled RECs are very accessible to anyone, even if you don't own your office space, and generally accessible to wherever you're located. Essentially, you're purchasing additional renewable energy credits on top of whatever energy you're sourcing. In some markets, like in DC and Maryland, it's a deregulated market, so you can actually choose where your energy is coming from. And so in those cases, if you get a bill from Pepco or BG&E, you can actually choose an energy provider that's 100% renewable, 100% wind, or a mix of that, rather than the standard mix. And then the other options are a little bit more advanced, but are growing in popularity as well. On-site solar and wind when the space permits, community solar in some cases if the space doesn't, and then renewable energy power purchase agreements, which are a really interesting mechanism that actually drives more renewable energy development. So these are all green energy procurement options.
So up to this point, the sustainability initiatives we've been discussing go to what the Interaction Climate Compact categorizes as internal operations, those applicable to headquarters and office operations in other locations. Here we look at programming at the humanitarian and development work that organizations do locally in communities around the world.
So I'm assuming that most of the participants on this call are Interaction members and are involved in some kind of humanitarian or development programming, whether that's in the U.S. or overseas. Americares, in terms of our programming, we divided it into these four categories, and what we've been trying to do is to look at each one of these categories and see, how climate change is going to affect that space. So in terms of our Access to Medicine program, which distributes medicines and medical supplies, to partners all over the world, we want to be able to, identify, source, and distribute those that are going to be increasingly critical, especially in relation to climate-related to disasters. In terms of our clinical services, we're looking to develop frameworks and train providers on what the health impacts of climate change, are going to be, for their particular area, and how that is going to affect, how they provide care and make decisions as providers. We do a lot of humanitarian work and emergency response, and part of that is a preparedness training program specific for health centers to help them sort of prepare for disasters and to be better equipped to be operational in their wake, and to address the specific health needs of survivors after a disaster occurs. And we also do community health programming. And so how can we build capacity and raise awareness through all of our community health partners in terms of rolling out further climate mitigation and adaptation strategies. And I think, as NGOs, I think it's one thing to look at our internal operations and track our greenhouse gas emissions and set targets and reduce, our environmental impact of our operations. But I think, our programs are really what our work really magnifies our work. And so I think that this is one area that may actually have the biggest difference in terms of, our global reach and all the partners that we work with through our programs.
Here are a few programming considerations from Global Communities and PCI's perspective. First, we found that communities don't need to be convinced about climate change and that it's a threat. They are on the front line, and they often have very appropriate ideas on, if not the resources for, climate adaptation and mitigation. Our approach is to bridge local knowledge with climate risk information and climate resilience strategies and empower communities to take collective action to address climate change. So neither Global Communities nor PCI are like traditional environmental organizations. However, we have implemented a number of programs with environmental resilience components, such as watershed management in Malawi and Honduras, regenerative agriculture in Ethiopia, reforestation and erosion control in Haiti, and climate change adaptation planning and disaster risk reduction in Colombia. So this all leads me to my final point, which is moving forward, global communities and PCI can and should start viewing more of our programming through a climate risk management lens. And the good news is that this is one of the areas that the Interaction Climate Compact addresses to, quote, begin mainstreaming climate and environmental considerations into all stages of programs to reduce our emissions and any environmental degradation resulting from our work. In the process, maximize the resilience and adaptation of affected communities, close quote. So that brings us to the end of all of our sustainability initiatives. Lindsay, did we get any questions?
I think there was one question in the chat that was answered, but we can take this opportunity to pause and see if any others on the call want to unmute themselves and ask a question about the two previous sections on marshaling support and sustainability initiatives. So feel free to ask questions.
We're actually more than halfway there. Okay, so let's move on to challenges to expect and prepare for. So in my experience as the Green Team leader at Global Communities, staff apathy has to be the #1 challenge I think we faced. Some staff, regardless of messaging or awareness raising, just can't be bothered with sustainability. Staff apathy is boiled over once or twice into irritation with the Green Team. As I mentioned, not everyone is thrilled to have plastic silverware replaced by reusable silverware, if only because now they have to wash their silverware instead of throwing it in the wastebasket. And as you might imagine, it's easy to become discouraged in the face of apathy or irritation. And that's why it's good to have a team for mutual support and to have messaging that is clear and solution oriented.
And I think for working with landlords, many of us may be renting commercial real estate or renting small office spaces. It can be tricky if you already have experienced resistance to doing sustainability updates to the office. But in general, I feel like the lessons from the sustainable contracting and sustainable procurement could be used if you are at the point where you're deciding on an office space or renewing your lease. Really, those are opportunities to also incorporate sustainability questions through your broker or to the management companies that you're potentially viewing, asking about if they do LEED certification, what their schedule for recertification might be, what kind of approaches they take for waste, which is a building level and typically a landlord-driven decision. And then even thinking about things like the bike storage rooms, how parking works, all of those pieces can be discussed at that lease signing stage so that everyone's aware of that ambition, and you could potentially still use that as leverage as part of your lease signing as well. But if you are stuck in a situation where you do have some resistance to it, I think the same approach as you may take to an audience that has some sort of resistance to sustainability could be used. Really consider them a stakeholder and figure out what those barriers are. When we were doing our compost pilot, we did run into a barrier that our landlord was worried specifically about pests and odor in the loading dock. And so that's how we came across the idea to do a 1-year pilot. And in that pilot, there were provisions for reviewing all the concerns that the landlord had and all of the goals that we had. And so really kind of breaking that down and unpacking what the barriers are and finding ways that you might be able to address some of them can be helpful. But there are times when sometimes the landlord does not value those sustainability actions, and perhaps in those cases you may consider sharing some of the resources and data out there that shows LEED certifications and green buildings are attractive to tenants. So really appealing to the bottom line and the dollar value for them may be helpful as well.
And I'll talk also here, about keeping up the momentum on your sustainability initiative within your organization. And I kind of approach it from two different categories. And in neither category, I really had a solution to until actually fairly recently. So the first category of keeping up the momentum is really just in terms of staff and time. You know, I mentioned at Americares, our sustainability working group is made up of volunteers, you know, who have full-time jobs. And so keeping the focus on, you know, sustainability within our organization has been a challenge, especially when, you know, we're distracted with our everyday jobs. And so how to keep that motivation, how to keep that momentum and amongst that group, you know, has been a challenge in the past, and it's sort of uncertain, you know, how it's going to progress moving forward. And then the second challenge is around, you know, just in terms of how far-reaching all of these initiatives we've been talking about, how far they go within each of our organizations. You know, we've talked about travel policies, we've talked about procurement, we've talked about our programming, our energy use. This kind of touches every aspect of our organization. And I am assuming that none of us on this call are CEOs who have like a top-down mandate to tell your HR department to do something one way, to tell your procurement department to do something another way. Instead, we're kind of a grassroots sort of movement trying to bubble this stuff up from the bottom. And so trying to move all of these levers at once is another big challenge. And the solution to all of this, or one of the solution to all of this, actually, I think is going to be this this climate compact that we'll get to later on, which is kind of exerting a bit of, you know, external pressure on our organizations to step up in this space. And I think having that external pressure is really going to be helpful to us as, you know, sustainability managers within our organization move forward in this space.
So finally, on to the many resources and solutions out there for a more sustainable future. But first, let's take another poll question. Lindsay, over to you.
Great. So I just launched one more poll that we have around how useful a resource library on these sustainability topics would be. So feel free to click in a response and we'll share the results shortly. All right, well, I'll stop it there and share our results. Looking like it would be something at least half of the participants would find useful. So that's great.
Well, I'm glad no one says it wouldn't be useful. That's good to know.
We have a question from Darren Posey. I hope I'm saying your name right, with Catholic Relief Services, that's around for organizations with field operations like Global Communities of PCI and WRI, any challenges or lessons learned in gathering and collating greenhouse gas data, so air travel, utilities, emissions, fleet, from field offices as part of baseline and monitoring. So I don't know if someone wants to speak to that question around challenges, lessons learned.
Well, I can jump in and say that we have done nothing in this regard. And this is one of the areas that I think where global communities can move forward on sustainability, especially working with WRI on the tools and interaction on, you know, some collaborative efforts with other organizations. But Karl, it sounds like your organization is doing some of that on your overseas program, yeah?
No, again, we're sort of in the same boat. We've been collecting tools to do so, and there are some NGOs that have done this in terms of sending out surveys to their field offices that they then complete on a yearly basis. So it has been done, but I think the big challenge that we all probably know from the beginning is just, you know, making sure that those surveys are filled out and obviously making sure that they're accurate and reflective of what is actually happening in the field.
Yeah, we don't necessarily have what's traditionally called field offices. Some of our global offices are subsidiaries and some are independent, but under the brand umbrella of WRI. So our international footprint can be very tricky. We don't necessarily say to an office in China, Indonesia, India, like, you have to get us this data. It's purely voluntary, but what we have found has been helpful is finding the right person in those offices, especially the operations or office manager roles. They tend to come across things like utility bills, expense reports, and other data, and then finding ways that we can make the data collection and data entry as easy for them as possible on top of their everyday roles. So that's definitely a really good question, and it's something that we struggle with too. And I think moving forward, we're going to have to be able to find the capacity to be able to collect that data on the ground more. So not just borrowing on their time, but finding a way that we can make it a baked in part of their role and compensate them for it.
Great. So David, did you want to continue a little bit more with to finish off the presentation? We can get to some more questions afterwards.
Yeah. So Shane, this one's over to you.
Yes, so there are a lot of resources out there at different levels. So this is by no means a comprehensive set. Internationally, I think everyone is familiar with the SDGs and the work of the IPCC. I would just call them out as good resources to use if you're looking for a framework to talk about sustainability that connects to global efforts around different actions. So really finding ways that you can connect the projects that you'd like to do in your office to those SDG goals, how they link up. So for example, our food waste efforts connects to that goal 12. And we've actually worked together with a number of other global organizations on Champions 12.3, which is an initiative, a global initiative around food waste reduction. IPCC, their reports are dense and huge, but they're really great if you're looking for data and citations to show why it matters at a global level. So if you're looking for facts and numbers that you can cite about the global impacts of temperature change, the potential for flooding in coastal cities around the world, they're a really great resource. And they have specific assessment reports by topic as well. So some years they focus more on the building sector, others more on food. And then topical campaigns are now also very global. This past July, we started to do Plastic Free July at WRI as well, and we borrowed from the resources created by Break Free from Plastic. It's an organization out of Australia, I believe. And so they created and connected a number of different campaign materials, whether you were an individual or an organization or a school teacher, they consolidated all of those materials on their website. And then finally, if you're more on the finance side, the Principles for Responsible Investment is also a great starting point if you're looking to sustainably invest and do ESG screening of your endowment, which is a little bit of something we didn't touch on today, but it's another international collaboration that's really positive in terms of outcomes. Here in the US, it's a little bit trickier as some of the resources haven't been updated as frequently as we'd like. But in, I think, 2016, 2017, we actually did finish the 4th climate assessment, despite the current administration. It's a great resource. It's an interactive report, so it's actually really engaging to read on your screen too. A lot of data that you can use if you want to then make that case for why it matters for the US. So all of that data that I talked about for IPCC, the climate assessment for the US makes it specific to US cities and US data. And then if you're working a little bit more tangibly on energy, the DOE energy.gov has a lot of resources, whether you're looking for your home or your office building or anywhere else. They have specific guides. Some of the screenshots here show if you're in a design stage and doing a renovation or an update, they're really great resources. If you're trying to do some DIY projects at home and thinking about energy efficiency, they also have great resources and calculators. And then if you're thinking about these things for communications and engaging staff, the EPA and Energy Star have, not to reinvent the wheel, they have really great campaigns and engagement and communications materials that you can borrow upon as well.
So on to state and local government resources. If you're interested in sustainability and you live or work in Washington, D.C. or Montgomery County in Maryland, you're in luck. These are two of the most environmentally progressive jurisdictions in the nations, with lots of people working on sustainability and lots of resources to help move your program forward. With over 3,000 miles of shoreline susceptible to and already experiencing sea level rise, the state of Maryland is also active pursuing climate mitigation and adaptation strategies, including by establishing the Maryland Climate Leadership Academy, which is the first such entity in the nation. So we've already talked about the benefits of networking with like-minded organizations. These are some of the green businesses and nonprofits that Global Communities has connected with in the last year. The World Resources Institute for a speaker on sustainability, the Center for Biological Diversity for a speaker on endangered species and biodiversity loss, Veteran Compost for greenhouse gas and waste reduction, and Plant Burger in Silver Spring, Maryland for plant-based burgers. This, however, is not the end, but just the very, very beginning of all the businesses and nonprofits out there sharing knowledge and best practices, collaborating or competing, but all pulling in the same direction for a more sustainable future. Lindsay, over to you.
Great. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of what we are working on in terms of implementation of the Climate Compact. Today's presentation is very much under that purview as we're kicking off this environmental sustainability working group, and we'll start to get into meetings that have more opportunities for kind of back and forth and these questions around lessons learned and peer-to-peer support. I wanted to mention two other work streams that we have going on right now, one on climate advocacy and another on climate mainstreaming in programs. So I know we've been kind of referencing this idea of how to, that our real kind of major impact is going to be around how we change programs. And so we have an entire working group dedicated to that question. And whereas the environmental sustainability working group can kind of think through the greenhouse gas reduction plans, both at headquarters and in country and field offices, and the programming working group will be talking about kind of those intersections between food security programs and climate, or water programs and climate, and kind of what does that overlay look like, and what are the risks and opportunities that we need to start to think about. So just really encourage everyone to get involved as you are today, and happy to be in touch with anyone interested to learn more.
Okay. So, Shengyin, over to you, I think.
Great. We have one last poll question. This one's a little bit more open-ended. So for those that might be on their phone, please go to www.menti.com and use the code 320690. We're essentially asking you to enter any statements on what will your organization do next on sustainability. And I think while people enter their responses, you'll be able to see it on the screen. For those that can see the screen, we'll share some as well. And I think we're opening it up for questions as well.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you to Shengyin, David, and Karl for that fantastic presentation. I think a lot of food for thought and ideas for organizations to consider. So this time, the remainder of the time will be for questions. So feel free to unmute yourselves and introduce who you are and your affiliation, ask your question.
Looks like we're getting some responses on track headquarters GHG emissions, behavior change, strategy planning, and measurement. Discuss and prioritize sustainability initiatives. Yeah, and I think, you know, a couple of things about the behavior change piece. I've really appreciated working with some of the folks at WRI that are behavioral economists or behavioral science folks. They have managed to put some of the barriers that we've gotten on sustainability in the scope of sort of some of the irrationality of our human brains. And they're so very patient and rational about thinking about how do we get past some of those barriers. So if you do have the opportunity to check out either Nudge or Dan Ariely's books, they're really interesting to read, and I think they make you a little bit less cynical about some of the naysayers on sustainability.
Thanks, Shane.
I have a question if now is a good time.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you all so much for the presentation. Really interesting. I have a question on green contracting, and I'm kind of curious about this because I work at CRS and we have partners all around the world. I see this as a really interesting opportunity. So I think, Shengyin, you brought up the slide where you said, you know, potentially to ask your partners whether they're doing certain activities and then kind of helping them along their journey if they're not. I think that's such a compelling idea. So maybe you and Karl can help me with this question. Are there funding opportunities that you all are seeing to pursue this kind of work? Because obviously, like, that would be a pretty large capacity strengthening initiative if we were to embark on that journey. So I'm just thinking, like, from your perspective, have you been learning about different funding opportunities that would help with that? Thanks.
I haven't seen any external funding opportunities, but you're right that it is a big endeavor. We've gone as far as instituting the piece of our sub-agreement that asks those questions and collects that data. And I think the numbers are that we work with thousands of vendors in each year, and it's not necessarily one hotspot vendor or partner. And so when you start to break that down, we'd have to get a certain number of participants for it to really start to impact our footprint. And our estimates were that we would need to be helping out on 50 GHG emissions inventories. So that's also where we've been trying to figure out what's the next step here. And for WRI, I think we're not going to necessarily seek outside funding. We're exploring the possibility of expanding the carbon pricing mechanism to be able to offer that to our partners.
Yeah, and I would also add that I have not seen funding opportunities for NGOs trying to take on this work, but I think that there could be an opportunity to as a collective, as Interaction members, for example, or just as a community in general, if this is a need that we can collectively raise to the donor community, maybe that's one way to do it. I also think, there may be also local government, sort of like business, local business opportunities, like with local chambers of commerce and that sort of thing that could also be tapped for like your HQ operations and that sort of thing. But that would be on a, that would be very context and locally specific basis, I would think.
The only other thing I'll add to that that is, I think, a little bit more specific on the carbon footprint studies, which will be the topic of one of our upcoming working group meetings, is kind of this idea that we have 80+ NGOs that have committed to the climate compact, and there's going to be a percentage of those organizations that want to do carbon footprint studies, including looking at their field offices and their kind of broader global reach. And so there's an opportunity to kind of have some collective bargaining when it comes to working with vendors that offer carbon footprint studies, and to have that really tailored. So the quality of it is very tailored to the activities of international nonprofits working in global development and humanitarian assistance. And if we're all doing it at a similar time frame and working with a handful of firms, there might be an opportunity to decrease the cost of some of that too, for what that's worth. So Naomi Rutenberg, who I think is with Child Fund, also had a question in the chat. And I can read it out, but Naomi, feel free to unmute and elaborate. She asks, can you please talk a bit about how you selected the sustainability standards for your organization? And Naomi, I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
No, just curious about, one of the speakers mentioned that one of the challenges is how far to reach into the organization, and that comes with engaging a lot of different parts of the organization. So just curious, when you were at the outset, about how did you decide, at least in the first phase, what your goals were going to be, what your standards you wanted to achieve?
Well, I can speak to that. A lot of the standards that we settled on were in our green business certification application. They gave us a whole range of different initiatives and standards, and you could kind of pick and choose which ones you wanted to try to meet across 5 different categories, which basically some of which we've seen here today in this presentation. So, we, through the green team, we sat down and we figured out, well, which of these standards can we meet most likely? And so we finalized our list, and then we submitted it to senior management for approval. And then, that was the basis for implementing those standards, is because we did have some discussion around which standards we thought were appropriate, and we got our senior management, the president, actually, the company, to sign off. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thanks. Any other experiences from others?
Yeah, I would add that this isn't necessarily so much about standards, but it's about where to start. And I think that depends on the organization, and it depends on who you're dealing with. If you have a head of a department that is not receptive to these sorts of initiatives, that's obviously not the place to start. But where you can find allies and like-minded folks, and can kind of get to some quick low-hanging fruit projects and where you can start to demonstrate progress, I think that's where to start. For us, I think looking at climate change through our programmatic lens has been a good first step for us, because there were a lot of people on our programs team that really cared passionately about this topic, and so that was a good place for us to start, because we had a lot of traction there already. Whereas getting a recycling program started, or trying to reduce travel, or reduce or optimize our supply chain, those were we need to look at all those things, but they're going to be trickier for us to crack at the moment. So low-hanging fruit to start with, and then building on that over time is how we've got going.
That's great advice. Thank you.
Naomi, I can also add that we talked a bit about rolling out green initiatives to our other locations. So what we'll probably do is take a scaled down list of the different standards that we used in headquarters, and share those with our field offices, and then let them pick and choose from the types of initiatives and standards that they think are appropriate for their location. And also, if you're interested, I can just email you the list. It's from Montgomery County Department of Environmental Protection. It's a spreadsheet, and it just has a bunch of different standards across 5 or 6 different categories.
That'd be terrific. Thank you.
Yeah. And I suppose I would just add, I know WRI is a little bit different in that our mission is a little bit more focused on the environment, and much of our standards were a result of in-house piloting of our own products. But 3 different things I would recommend if someone is starting out is to really find standards that connect to your mission. So part of what we were doing was about building our credibility as an environmental organization. And so those drove a lot of the standards that we chose, but then also looking for standards that are transparent in their methods. I do think there unfortunately are a lot of documents and resources and certifications that are run by either first party or second party, meaning they have a stake in you joining on and essentially advocating for the sector more than for your environmental or social and sustainable development goals. And then finally, you know, I think the other piece of it is really looking for standards for a reason, but looking outside of the sector too and finding what others are doing, because aligning with some of the other sectors and other organizations ultimately and being able to compare and have a common language to talk about is helpful too. So figuring out, you know, who else is using what and what's being adopted more around in your sector and your organizations and your peer networks. So building in that future planning a little bit, knowing that you may at one point start sharing your GHG data or start sharing your progress, that it fits into a framework that others are aware of as well.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much, all three of you. That was very helpful.
Are there other questions? As folks think about that, I just wanted to underscore what Shengyin said about connecting it to mission of the organization. I think also in interactions experience, we just did a carbon footprint study that was based on 2019 data. And I think the motivation for doing that was very much linked with this idea that we're a membership-based organization, and us having an internal environmental sustainability initiative is part of that, you know, being part of a community of other organizations that are also working on that, and to kind of have had that learning opportunity ourselves, to have gone through it, to then be working with our members. So I think every organization is going to have their own analog for what that is, whether it's a child-focused organization or a water-focused organization. So I think that's a really great point. I wanted to leave space for any last-minute burning questions before we close out.
And I think we can share our contact information slide as well, if anyone has other questions for either or any of us.
Right, I'll get that up there, I think.
Great.
Can people see that?
Not yet.
Gosh.
But while you work on that, David, I'll just mention a few closing notes. Next week on Tuesday, June 30th, we're having our first engagement with our climate advocacy working group on understanding U.S. public opinion and disinformation on climate change, exploring how tactics used in the tobacco industry have been used to fuel climate denial and delay action, especially in the U.S. So welcome you to join that conversation if you're interested. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to be doing a follow-up session on how to get started with carbon footprint studies. And so we'll do, you know, similar format, bringing in some speakers to speak to those experiences. And I see a question in the chat about sharing the slides. We can definitely share the slides, and we've recorded this session, and we'll have that available on our website for folks to refer back to. And lastly, I'll just mention we have a beta version of a resource library also up on our website that I can include in a follow-up message, where you can start to go through some of the resources that have been mentioned today, as well as the environmental or climate change policies that many of our member organizations are developing. And if your organization does develop a policy and is willing to share that for the benefit of other community members looking at it, we're very happy to put that up there. And with that, I just wanted to once again thank our speakers, Karl, David, and Shengyin. Greatly appreciate all the work you put into putting this webinar together, and really look forward to the conversations to come. Thank you again, everyone.
Thanks, Lindsay, and thanks to the participants.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Take care.